Hello, this is Adem Carroll. I'm the Burma Task Force team lead at Justice for All and also serving as the point person at the United Nations. Justice for All has been working since, well, it's 9 years at least. We've been working on the issue of the Uyghur and the uh, Kashmir and the Indian minorities and all the persecuted minorities, but above all on the Rohingya genocide. And in Burma, this is what first drew our attention. However, 1 year ago, on February 1st, 2021, the same Burmese military that perpetrated genocide against the Burmese Muslim minority also perpetrated a military coup, bringing down the government of Aung San Suu Kyi, the NLD government, and beginning a year-long crisis with increasing violence, uh, thousands arrested, killed, bombings, most recently the Christmas Eve massacre, plenty of war crimes. And these acts of brutality arise as part of a pattern. The Tatmadaw, the name of the Burmese military, has been in power for many decades, and our expert speakers today will be reflecting on the patterns and the lessons, perhaps. Will their analysis inform actions? Will we be able to better understand how to confront the Burmese military, who are very much still in control despite a very brave and determined resistance by most Burmese, and a very diverse and fragmented country? Increasingly poor, increasingly in crisis, also facing COVID pandemic problems. And so, what are the possibilities for Burma in the next year? Will we see a victory for democracy and for the forces of democracy? It's going to be quite a struggle. And so we have today two experts, and perhaps we'll be joined by a third. We're going to start with Dr. Roger Lee Huang, lecturer on terrorism studies and political violence at Macquarie University. And please correct me if I'm mispronouncing anything. He has broad research interests in the politics, international relations, and security of East and Southeast Asia. He has previously worked in Hong Kong, in Taiwan, and interned with the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime in Yangon, Burma. He's the author of The Paradox of Myanmar's Regime Change. And then after Roger, we'll have Dr. Rushda Siddiqui, primarily a freelance social science researcher and human rights activist working on gender, comparative international politics, and development. Rushda is formerly Associate Fellow at the Institute for Defense Studies and Analyses in New Delhi. Currently an executive committee member of the National Federation of Indian Women, she is managing the research and advocacy units of the Federation's Delhi unit. So welcome both of you. And Dr. Roger Lee Huang, please go ahead.
Thanks for inviting me to the show. So as most of you will be aware, of course, following the February 1st coup d'etat last year, where the Tatmadaw, the Myanmar military, has once again reasserted its dominance and absolute control of the state apparatus. But quickly, to correct myself, it has attempted to return absolute military rule. But now, 11 months in, almost a year since the coup, you can see that the military has not prevailed as it probably had assumed it would have when it launched the coup. Now, really, Myanmar is now in a very intense, heated situation. There is political violence throughout the whole country. where even though there has been ever since Myanmar got its independence in 1948, there's been ongoing ethnic and other communist insurgencies against the government. We have not seen the type of scale of this type of violence for about 2 decades, and now that has returned. In addition to the old armed ethnic organizations, you have a lot of new militia groups that has formed up. And much of this is, these new groups are a direct reaction against the brutality of the Tatmadaw, this military junta. So these People's Defense Force, large majority of them having pledged their allegiance essentially to the parallel shadow government, the NUG, the National Unity Government, which is largely staffed by parliamentarians and other politicians and democratic leaders, most of them from the National League for Democracy, that is the most popular pro-democracy party in the country, but also some ethnic leaders and ethnic groups have joined this coalition. And there are also a lot of complexities to this, so I'll try my best to make it as clear as possible. But this People's Defense Force that I've just mentioned is also just a loose coalition of different militia groups. So there are groups that might have more direct interaction with the older ethnic armed organizations. They might have some direct interaction with the National Unity Government, but a lot of them are also kind of independent militia groups that normally pledge their allegiance but are run essentially by local leaders, in the different townships and villages and whatnot. And also there is a few key paradigm shifts that I would like to mention and talk about, so to kind of see what has changed in Myanmar. Right, you have a country that has seen uninterrupted ethnic insurgencies against the state, against the government, whether it's in the early stages of the early stages of independent Burma, that was against the authorities, the elected authorities, in fact, and then later against the military regime. Now, this new paradigm shift today is that, one, we've always assumed the Tatmadaw as being this infallible key institutional figure that has almost absolute dominance over society. And that hasn't changed too much, in the sense that, yes, the military remains to be the most capable, with the most resources and most centralized power. But at the same time, the inability of the military to convince the people to lay down arms, the inability of the military to convince civil servants to come back to work. I should add that right after the coup, there was a massive civil disobedience movement, which was actually led by civil servants, right, where they refused to go back to work, where trained workers, hospital doctors and nurses, educators in schools, all of these people refused to go back to work. And even now, 11 months on, yes, the military has used different coercion and incentives to encourage them to come back, but there is still a lot of civil servants that have continued to hold out. So we have now exposed, or really the opposition, the anti-military opposition has exposed the fallacy of the military, that it doesn't have the type of control that in the vision it has. Despite their military superiority, it has not been able to silence urban guerrilla fighters in central Burma, as well as against the ethnic armed groups. Now, another big paradigm shift that, if I have time, I want to mention is also how the opposition has changed. Now, many people would be aware that even though Myanmar was technically undergoing some sort of democratic transition since 2011, I've always emphasized that Myanmar has never genuinely democratized, that even when Aung San Suu Kyi and the National League for Democracy won the election back in 2015, 2016, that this was, as per the constitution written by the military, a disciplined democracy. So it wasn't a democracy that we, most people were familiar more with the liberal Western democratic style of governance as a genuine democracy, because the military still continued to hold on several levels of power. And beyond that, Aung San Suu Kyi and NLD weren't the best examples of liberal Democrats when they had some control over policies and government between 2016 until the coup. Of course, given the linkage to this network, most of you would be aware that Aung San Suu Kyi was no friend of the Rohingya populace, obviously, and wasn't even sympathetic to a large majority of the ethnic minority groups in their decades of grievances against the military, and to some extent also against the Burma, kind of the main Burma ethnic groups' chauvinism. But that has changed. Again, that is the second kind of key paradigm shift I want to talk about, which is that now the national unity government and those kind of the anti-regime and the broader Burma population have recognized that, in fact, they have been fed and believe a lot of the military propaganda. Now there are, especially younger generation, what we refer to as the Gen Z, those that were really at the initial forefront of the civil disobedience movement. They have come up publicly apologizing for their behavior against Rohingya, their behavior against some ethnic minority groups. And NUG has also technically released the statement, I think, several months back, saying they are going to basically revoke the 1982 citizenship law, which basically made Rohingya and other large other minority groups stateless in Myanmar. So they have now changed their position. In many ways, I think it is a way to try to convince the broader international community to support them. But I think there is some genuine soul searching now that they are seeing the type of physical, violent coercion that the military is dealt to the Burma people. So they've now recognized that, in fact, perhaps Rohingya really were the victims that they have always claimed to be, and that there is some soul searching needed there. But I also don't want to oversell that before I run out of my time, that there is still some resistance even within the NUG and kind of the pro-democracy movement, who are still reluctant to go all out to actively embrace these minority groups, which they have for decades been basically demonized as the other. I don't know if I should add anything else, or should I give my time to Dr. Rushda Siddiqui?
Yes, before we pass it over to Dr. Rushda, I did want to ask you two questions. One is, 1 year ago, why did the military do this when Aung San Suu Kyi was fairly compliant, it seemed? Did they think this was necessary? Is it something in the nature of the hierarchy of the Tatmadaw? And then my other question is, you did work in Burma, and I was wondering if your work on drug and other criminal enterprises also gave you a window on some of the corruption of the Tatmadaw.
Yeah, so for the why question, I think that's the $1 million question, right? Everyone is asking why. A lot of the political scientists and others that have followed Myanmar closely were somewhat surprised, right? The 2008 constitution that was basically drafted, written, and implemented by the military allowed this disciplined democracy, right? And as I've kind of briefly mentioned, when Aung San Suu Kyi and NLD came into semi-power, where they shared a enforced coalition government with the military between 2016 and 2021, they often sided with the military, right? Aung San Suu Kyi personally went to The Hague to defend against the Gambia's charges against the Myanmar state of genocide against Rohingya. Aung San Suu Kyi and NLD supported the military's action against the Arakan army in the Rakhine state, etc. And they were also no friends, the NLD civilian government, that is, they were not real friends of the media. So again, so what? Why has the military done this? Why has it shut its own foot when they designed this disciplined democracy system, then just to overthrow it? There are obviously many different explanations. The most popular one, and there is obviously a degree of truth to this, is of course Min Aung Hlaing, that is the senior general commander-in-chief and now the head of the military junta, his personal ambitions, right? He obviously would not be able to become a president following the 2019, 2020 election results, right? So it was, a lot of people have looked at Min Aung Hlaing saying, well, the Supreme Commander himself wanted to be president. And of course, there's truth to that. But as I've kind of also emphasized in my own book, that we really need to understand the logic and the character of the military regime and Tatmadaw itself. Well, I think the Tatmadaw really sees itself as the main political defender of the nation, right? And that it wants to model and create Myanmar as in the image that it perceives to be what Myanmar should be. So yes, Aung San Suu Kyi didn't really diverge too much in a lot of what the military was doing, but at the same time, it showed that the military did not have the type of popularity and legitimacy that it perceives that it deserves. So there are many ways to look at it. Some people believe that perhaps the military really bought into their own propaganda, which is that there was electoral fraud. If on the very top you have Min Aung Hlaing and his senior leaders getting from their informants saying, oh, the military is doing fine, we're all happy. I mean, I believe even in Naypyidaw, where it would be the heart of the military, they also lost plenty of seats there, from the electoral results, which then, it either demonstrates that genuinely that people dislike the military, which I think is pretty evident that they do, perhaps not to the senior leadership of the military, but two, also, if the military recognized this result as being legitimate, then there's serious concern that they would eventually be replaced by a more genuine civilian non-military power to take over this disciplined democracy of their design. So I think in many ways it's to preempt that Aung San Suu Kyi and NLD to then be allowed to further change the disciplined democratic design of the military. So it's really more of that, in my opinion. So that, yes, the personal ambition is important, but more so that the military, despite what we see now as, in a rational world, you would think, why is the military doing this, hurting its own economic interest and legitimacy? But from their perspective, I think it is to ensure the continued loyalty of the military, of the grassroots soldiers, the people in the front line, right? And to ensure that the military will still continue to prevail without any real challenge of power from other power centers that the military can't directly control. Now, your second question, I think I've run a little bit and can't exactly recall what the second question was. If you could just remind me.
Mute. Okay, unmuting. Yeah, since you had worked in the Drug and Crime Prevention Office of the UN, yeah, what would you reflect on the Burmese military's involvement in drugs and crime?
Quickly, my own personal experience. I was an intern, for about 6 months in Yangon. I did have the opportunity to go to a WA special region, but this was also nearly 2 decades ago. But I don't think much has changed, right? The military is the biggest, not just political actor, but also the biggest economic actor in the country. They are literally involved in almost any sector that you can imagine, right? Of course, the big one is gas, and which we'll obviously talk about in a little bit, I'm sure. But also, it's involved in tourism. It's involved in the jewelry, like ruby, the jade, all of these industries. It's involved, of course, in retail, running of hotels. And of course, a lot of the underground economy, whether it's, as you've kind of implied, the underground, the drugs, but also arms manufacturing, and again, telephone networks, pretty much everything. And I think this change, which has preceded, obviously, the coup, right? So this has existed really since Myanmar started kind of reforming its economy in the early 1990s, but has really grown in size, where the military now, there's often talk about how pre-opening up of this economy, the top officials might be happy with a bottle of army-made rum and some badminton sets, but now even kind of military captains and that have like plenty of cars and have their nice golf clubs and all this stuff. So corruption has been a real issue, and it's one of the key driving factors that has allowed the military to be united and to be loyal, because for many of the military, especially of the officers class, this is their main way to achieve material wealth, and as well as, in their eye, a legitimacy and reputation, because the people might not like them, but within the military, they're still respected and they still have access to power and resources.
We'll continue that conversation, but we have a quick break, and then right after we'll be back with Dr. Rushda Siddiqui, and we've been hearing from Roger Lee Huang, calling in from Australia, Macquarie University. So stay tuned. We'll be right back.
If I could be you, and you could be me for just 1 hour, walk a mile in my shoes, walk a mile in my shoes.
There are 16 million children struggling with hunger in America. That's 1 in 5 daughters, sons, neighbors, and classmates who don't know where their next meal is coming from. Yet billions of pounds of good food go to waste every year. It's time we do something about it. Feeding America is a nationwide network of food banks that helps provide meals to millions of kids and families in need. Visit feedingamerica.org to help them feed even more. Together, we can solve hunger. Together, we're feeding America.
Yes, this is Adem Carroll back. We're talking about the 1-year anniversary of the military coup in Burma, how it affects Burmese, how it affects the region, and how it affects the Rohingya minority. So Dr. Rushda Siddiqui is on the phone here and on the screen from India, I think. Please join us.
Thank you so much, Dr. Carroll. And I'll start off from where Dr. Huang had, tried to bring in the focus on the corruption and the way the military is managing the Rohingya crisis and the entire situation in Burma. One aspect that I'd want to focus on is the kind of external support that the military junta gets, particularly from countries like India. We have a very long border with India, with Myanmar. We have Arunachal Pradesh, Nagaland, Mizoram, Manipur sharing a border. It's 1,700 kilometers long. The problems are basically economic. So you have the issue of Myanmar having the raw resources, China and India being the perfect markets, which is one of the reasons why we are seeing such a huge humanitarian crisis. I'm talking about the humanitarian crisis because I want you to understand the fact that the kind of support that the military regime is getting is because of this economic crisis. India wants to have railroads, India wants to have land connectivity. India sees China as a competitor in the economic market. India wants to ensure that however corrupt the military regime is, it stays in power. It's easier to negotiate there. With a democratic regime, yes, you can have your negotiations, but it's not going to be so fruitful. If you notice, just a few days back, actually, we had a very high-level delegation going for strategic military talks. India has been supplying arms and ammunition. India has been involved in all the economic trade paths with Myanmar. The impact is the humanitarian crisis because the areas in which the population is located, be it the Chins, be it the Rohingyas, be it the Nagas, all of them need to be evacuated from that place, and the land needs to be grabbed by both the governments so that you can go ahead with all the development tasks. 2 days ago, it was about 1 lakh families of Chinns who were trying to get into India. For a year, they've been refused the entry to India on the grounds of COVID protocol. But the bigger ground remains that you do not want to upset the military government. You do not want to make it into some sort of, this democracy which has been overturned, so India should go ahead and impose sanctions or support sanctions. It's about not making sure that the military government in Myanmar stays happy with the Indian regime. If you look at Myanmar, look at the border states in India and the way they are managed. They all come under something called the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, where the military in India has absolute power to go ahead, do anything with the civilian population. It's no different from Myanmar, all these 5 border states that I've been talking about. It's no different from Myanmar when it comes under a military regime. So the mainland India is hardly affected unless you have a refugee population coming in. And if you're talking about the border states, we are looking at a fomentation of infiltration of refugees, of camps, which are so-called terrorist camps being made on both sides of the border. There's a huge small arms exchange between these camps. And there is a lot of political instability as a result. If you notice, these 5 states are right now witnessing the rise of the right-wing government. Arunachal, Nagaland, Mizoram, Manipur, they're witnessing the rise of a right-wing government from India. The reason is just this, the very popular rhetoric of keep the infiltrators away. They're the ones who are coming to get your resources. Not realizing that the regime in Myanmar is actually focusing its violence on exactly these tribes and all these communities which are living in the border areas. That area needs to be emptied out. So that, or you need to have somebody extremely friendly who will benefit from the kind of economic and the kind of military strategic partnerships that you can have between India and Myanmar. The second thing that I'd want to focus on would be the role China has played. It's seen as an enemy, but somewhere along the line, it's been key in shaping India's foreign policy towards Myanmar. The fear of the Chinese stepping in, taking over, and being closer to Myanmar is what makes the India government react. Whether it was in 1962, whether it was in 1948, whether it was in 2011, whether it is in 2021. China remains a very, very important factor. And China is somebody we can never underestimate. India wants democracy in Myanmar. Until 2011, it was talking about supporting a democratic government in Myanmar. But at the same time, For strategic military interests, it wanted to support the military government. India has been accused of being a member of an observer member of the United Nations Security Council and not taking a stand. But we keep forgetting that China is part of the United Nations Security Council, and it is constantly supporting the kind of repression and suppression that is going on in Myanmar and in India. Nobody has taken any of the governments to task. Nobody has even questioned the existence of laws that suppress and actually make refugees out of local populations. Nobody is questioning the kind of legality that all the strategic and arms deals that are taking place are, whether they're valid, whether they're not. So I'm really not sure how much time I have more now, but these are the two things that I wanted to focus on. The role that China is playing, and China is not clean, India is not clean. Myanmar, of course. The corruption in the Myanmarese regime, the corruption in China, the corruption in India, all of them combine to create a humanitarian crisis. And all of them combine to cover up the humanitarian crisis. So that there is no very large talk about it. If you look at all the rhetoric that goes around in India, it's that Rohingyas are terrorists, the Chins are infiltrators. The Chins are treated slightly better, at least when they started coming in 1962, 2011, they were given some sort of a United Nations backing. They were given identity cards. They have the right to access Indian citizenship. The Rohingyas have been denied even that. The second round of Chins who are coming in since last year, they are again going to be denied that because this time it's a proper tsunami.
Well, this is a very troubling picture of geopolitical calculation at the expense of a humane perspective or humane treatment of minority groups. And obviously they're pawns in this game. And they also have their own needs and rights. They're not only pawns, but they're being treated that way. After we take a brief break, I wanted to ask not only about governments, but about businesses. Who are the development partners who are profiting from this conflict economy? So we'll be right back with Rushda Siddiqui and Roger Lee Huang just after this. And this is Adem Carroll back with you. Discussion of the 1-year anniversary of the military junta, the military coup in Burma, how it affects Rohingya, and all the minorities and all the people of Burma and the region. So we were just talking to Dr. Rushda Siddiqui, and had a question about profit and development partners. Besides the Indian state, what businesses or companies do you see profiting from this rather awful state of affairs?
The largest investor would be the state government itself. So the biggest beneficiaries would be whosoever is dealing with the military contracts. This could be any of the economic houses that have come up in the last 4 or 5 years, or long-standing partners, because the arms sales between India and Myanmar are really huge. They run in billions of dollars. So it's not something very small. And if you're looking at any of the arms deals, if you follow the money, it'll invariably be between the state government and whosoever is in power at that time. India is the only democracy in the region. So if you're looking at who is benefiting, look at who is the political power at the hem of affairs at that particular point of time. Right now, of course, it's out and out BJP. So they have their own houses of the Ambanis, the Adanis. Adanis are not so much into arms deals, but the Ambanis definitely are. And it's not just them, it's all the business partners who will be coming up with the trilateral highway constructions. All of them will be benefiting. But yes, the largest beneficiary will definitely be the state.
That is interesting. We do have a visual of arms sales. It's a bit dated, though. It's from 2016 from Al Jazeera. And as you see here, it indicates a whole range of countries that have been selling arms to Burmese military. Unfortunately, I would say that Russia, China, and India are at the top. There are some ongoing sales by Serbia, apparently, possibly by Ukraine. I believe Israel has stopped its sales, but it's a little unclear. But going back a number of years during the worst of the dictatorship, you see that quite a range of countries, including European countries, have been selling arms, and it's a dirty business. So unfortunately, this is sustaining the brutality. Another thing, though, is that this past week we had relatively excellent news that both Total and Chevron oil and gas companies were withdrawing entirely from Burma, from Myanmar, which, of course, activists have been demanding for many years, especially since the coup. So I was wondering if first Roger and then Dr. Rushda also, if you could comment on this and both the positive and also perhaps the negative, meaning, not all companies are withdrawing. So I was just wondering if you would like to comment on that.
Yeah, just about the arms sale, I won't say too much, but just point out the fact that I think it was just the end of last year, the Myanmar Navy got its first submarines, right? I think back in October, they got a first submarine, which is decommissioned by the Indian Navy using, I think, old Soviet technology. And of course, in December as well of last year, the Chinese also sold or transferred a submarine to the Myanmar Navy. And at the event, the ambassador of China, Chen Hai, was actually there. So it was all very much a positive event, I think, from the Chinese perspective, right? This continued close ties to try to seduce the Myanmar military generals. So kind of linking to back what I said earlier about when Myanmar reopens the economy and kind of also talking about why one of the main possible reasons why there was even a coup is because I think the military needs to keep their officers happy and loyal. And that's why they need these opportunities of military arms, right? These big fancy tanks, these new helicopters, even these submarines, these basically toys full of boys kind of mentality, right? To keep them, to have this prestige. We Myanmar with the Tatmadaw, we now have submarines. What are they going to use submarines for? I don't know. I think you have more important things to focus in your country than getting 2 submarines. But that's the state of the Tatmadaw. Now, a little bit more. I want to just talk a little bit more about the recent case, which is the withdrawal of Chevron and Total. Now, of course, my initial instinct, like most people and activists, are like, "Oh, hooray! This is a great thing. Finally, after trying to convince companies to withdraw their investments in Myanmar, they are paying attention and allegedly, supposedly, Total will cease their operation within 6 months." But I think this is part of the problem with the complexities of Myanmar, and that sometimes something that feels morally good and right might actually have an unintended consequence that we need to be more careful about. Because if you actually look at what is happening with the exit of Total and Chevron from the Yanna offshore gas field, is that they've also said they will basically receive no financial compensation for leaving their assets, and that they will transfer all their remaining interest and the operation of the gas field to their partners. Now, who are their partners? Chevron, who is also leaving, but also the Thai PTTEP petroleum company, and of course, the Myanmar Oil and Gas Enterprise, basically the state-owned enterprise by the state, which, again, that money channels into the military. And also, a key thing to remember is that much of the electricity generated here was actually supporting Yangon, so it was for domestic consumption, and also largely to the Thais. So there's absolutely no incentive that the Thais will withdraw their operation. They happily will basically gain these new shares and control of the operation. New partners might step in, sure. And of course, having mentioned about China, perhaps China will be a new partner to this gas field, right? So again, a lot of these things are in fact really, really complicated. And I'm not in a position to say whether this initial victory that people are celebrating would in fact really benefit the anti-regime movement, because effectively more resources might directly channel back into the Tatmadaw after the withdrawal. So it's that kind of thing, really kind of be careful what we wish for. And I think that's a broader issue here that we haven't really addressed, is that there has been a lack of real direction on how the broader international community can try and help the people of Myanmar. Now, there are 2 things I'd like to quickly mention before passing on my time to my fellow panelists. Is one, clearly, the international community has a very opinion on how to address Myanmar's situation. One, we've briefly talked about humanitarian crises. If that is the case, then there's certainly a lot more international community can do to try to address the humanitarian crises happening in that country. That includes really working very closely with the established NGOs inside the country. It includes talking to the ethnic groups who have control of their territories. It does include conversations, of course, with the NUG. But as bad as it sounds, at times, again, if the focus really is on just providing humanitarian aid and assistance, unfortunately, you might need to have a discussion and dialogue with the military in these circumstances. Now, the second thing is, if we want to see genuine political change or democracy of Myanmar, as a pacifist, in my relatively comfortable position here in Sydney, of course, I'd say, the de-escalation of violence, we shouldn't go, violence is not the main, and I know people advocate that, but you can understand why this is impossible, right? We've reached that point of no return where a large majority of the Burma people no longer can accept any sort of arrangement that the military government might introduce, which allegedly they will hold elections in August 2023 of next year, right? What does that mean? Even if they hold elections, will people just disappear and happily accept whatever the result is in August 2023? I think that has long gone. Going back to what I said, it's a real paradigm shift where the military is no longer seen as this real infallible organization. It can be challenged and has been challenged. So unfortunately, I think real cause of Myanmar's serious political issues that has dragged on, at least since 1962, if not earlier, is the military. It is the cancer in Myanmar, and it has to go. And unfortunately, it might seem like perhaps revolution is the only way. And again, I am no fan of political violence, even though I teach these things. But I know this will be terrible for the people of Myanmar. And a lot of people who are anti-regime will also, of course, suffer, and we are already suffering. So I think it's that soul searching I've also talked about. That also broader community needs to soul search. This hiding behind saying. Getting ASEAN to be involved, this ineffective UN, where it's done nothing, and these broader players, whether it's India or China or Russia, providing an environment for the military to continue the atrocities. Well, someone needs to step up and say, enough is enough. Perhaps, we really need a revolution, because we know ASEAN is not going to be able to get its acts together, and that is the only kind of international mechanism people are relying on at the moment. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, Dr. Rushda, would you share that same assessment, or would you like to add anything regarding the international response, its strengths and weaknesses?
I'd just like to add one little point. What Dr. Roger's saying is perfect. The only additional point that you need to understand is the kind of social transformation that is going on in Myanmar. The Rohingyas were ostensibly thrown out because they belong to a different religion. That level of fundamentalism, that level of tearing of social fabric is something which is going to be there for a very long time. So even if you remove the military regime, or even if you get a democratic government, the social problems are going to remain. And that gets funded and that gets armed to a very large extent by the small arms trade from India, from Thailand, to a certain extent China, but it's largely from the porous borders of India that you get the small arms, and it's all illegal. And drugs. Human trafficking, arms trafficking, drug trafficking, rampant in the region, in the border region, which is why you're able to have what we call as terrorist camps on both sides of the border. If we are looking at any of the external factors to come in, step in, and say this situation needs to change, the measures will have to be something of the magnitude that you are witnessing in, say, Afghanistan or in Iraq, where the governments have actually come in and have started re-educating societies about about the social fabric and about the need to maintain a multicultural society. Otherwise, it's not going to change. As Dr. Roger said, it's definitely not going to change.
So we've heard some quite sobering analysis from our two expert speakers today about the short and long-term, mostly long-term challenges facing the people of Burma, of Myanmar. Very diverse people, whether they can get their federation, whether they can get back their democracy, a full democracy, whether they can get peace, remains to be seen. We've heard that various geopolitical players, including India, but others as well, are selling arms to one side. Perhaps some of the small arms traffic is going to various groups and destabilizing and maintaining conflict. And yet, is there alternative to conflict? We haven't seen it in the ASEAN process yet. And so I think we're left with a very troubling picture for the months to come. And already we've been warned about the humanitarian crisis that's going to get worse before it gets better. So I think maybe on that rather dire note, we have to end here. But I hope that we can continue this conversation, because we've got to have a clearer idea about what is possible. What is the art of the possible when we don't even know what's possible? So hopefully the international community can be roused to work around some of the blockages in the UN and elsewhere. We can find some things to promote as far as policy goes. And I hope that those who are watching, some of you will want to help, whether you're helping just simply by joining our Burma Task Force action alerts and helping out every week with actions, tweeting, writing to officials and so forth, passing the Burma Act in US Congress and so forth. Or if you are wanting to work in partnership with the impacted communities. So we hope that we can be a force for better policy and for thinking about better policy. So thank you very much for both of you and your contribution today. We will be continuing the conversation with the second panel with Dr. Chris Siddiqui, and that will be tomorrow. He will be joined by other speakers from Burma Campaign UK and from Free Rohingya Campaign. So that will be tomorrow, and we'll be having other panels after that. So we'll keep the conversation going. Thank you all. Thank you, Dr. Roger Lee Huang, and to Dr. Rushda Siddiqui. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.